Hi, I'm going to be installing an oil cooler on my 2017 BRZ. And what makes this unique is it's actually the oil cooler off a 2022 BRZ. So they come standard on the new models that just came out with the new generation BRZ and GT86. And I ordered the parts online from a Subaru parts dealership. You'll see it does look slightly different than the popular mod out there where people use a Forester XT oil cooler. And it's my assessment that this oil cooler is going to do the job a little bit better, being that it's newer and developed specifically for the BRZ application versus an older one that was developed for a Forester wagon. Now, one of the differences you'll notice with this is it still has the tang right there that will give you the proper alignment of the oil cooler. And then both of these ports now are going to be located on the opposite side, which should put them closer to routing the hoses underneath the air conditioner compressor to the throttle body. And that's where I'm going to be pulling my coolant from. Now, both of these ports measure 3/8 inch in size. And on the old Forester oil cooler, one of them measured in 1/2 inch. So it was a big difference to step down from a 1/2 inch to a smaller port that's located on the throttle body. Now I chose to go with a 5/16 inner diameter heater hose. And if you do source the hoses yourself, make sure that you double check what you're getting before you leave the part supply store. I went to 3 different stores that claimed to have this in stock, and they try to sell me everything from transmission hose to fuel hose. So make sure you double check before you leave the store. This is what it looks like. Gates is a pretty good brand. That being said, I went in 5/16, which is gonna be a little bit smaller than is ideal for these 2 ports, but it's gonna allow me to have a smaller diameter hose when I connect it to those throttle body ports. So what I'm going to do is use a hair dryer, hopefully use heat to my advantage to heat up the ends of the hose. And then that should pretty easily go over these ports here. If I need to, I'll use a very, very light coating of silicone grease over these ports. Very minimal. And then because it's such a tight fit, this hose over those ports, it should push any excess up and not worry about contaminating any coolant. With that, I got Subaru Genuine Super Coolant. It's a little bit expensive from the dealership, but I chose to stick with OEM. It cost me just over $20. And in order to catch any coolant that spills from those throttle body hoses I'll be disconnecting, I'm gonna put this rag over the throttle body or over the intake manifold. Now when I attach the 2 hoses to both the oil cooler and those throttle body ports, I'm going to be using OEM type tension clamps. Now I prefer these a great deal over the worm style clamps that you'll see sold with some kits out there. I find that these clamps, the worm style, they can loosen over time and with heat cycles and just vibrations. So I don't like using these. I recommend not using them. I think there's a reason that the manufacturer doesn't use them. So yes, these can be a little bit more of a pain to deal with, but they're going to keep constant tension on your hoses and you're not going to have to worry about going back in there and tightening them up. So with that being said, I have needle nose pliers and another set of pliers. They don't look too hard to get to, but I am prepared to have a little bit of patience in order to have those both on there. Now, I also got myself a 24mm deep socket because I had to get a new stem. This stem is long enough to allow for it to slip through the oil cooler, like so, and then have enough threads on top. That's where I'm going to attach the oil filter to. And in order to remove the old stem, I have a breaker bar out and I'll use that same 24mm socket. And then I also have a torque wrench that I'm going to set to 40 foot-pounds, and I'm going to use the torque wrench to install that new fitting. And before I do install it, I'm going to make sure that I lubricate this seal with nice clean oil. The oil cooler itself came with that seal, so I didn't realize that. I actually purchased a seal with everything else that I got, but the seal that you see, that actually came already installed with the oil cooler. So if you know that, you'll save yourself another couple dollars. Whenever you're working with chemicals, I highly recommend wearing your PPE. So I have a couple gloves, and then I also have a box cutter out with a fresh blade in it and a piece of 2x4. I'm going to use that to cut these hoses to length. So that pretty much covers everything that I think I'm going to need to install this oil cooler. And then I'll film parts of the installation as I go, and hopefully that will help you out. So far the hairdryer is working pretty well. I have it set to high, and I hit the end of the hose for a couple minutes before I try to squeeze it onto the port. And before you do that, it's a good idea to have this clamp about 2 inches down the hose. So then once you do squeeze it on, you can just run the clamp up to the top with your pliers. And I did end up going with just a very, very, very light coat of that silicone around the porch, just to make it a little bit easier once you do squeeze it onto the end, just to push up further. And then you want to push the hose up until the lips that you see there. I have it inside a Ziploc now. This way I don't get it contaminated while I'm working on disassembling everything that I need to access the coolant lines. So the first step is going to be to disconnect your intake elbow. In this case, I have the aftermarket Perrin intake elbow. Should just be a couple hose clamps there, and then I may have to remove this clamp as well. And we're going to be accessing the coolant hose on that side of the throttle body. So with your intake elbow disassembled from the throttle body and the air box, next thing you're going to want to do is remove your oil filter. This is definitely strange. When I remove the oil filter, you can see it looks like there's a little bit of RTV inside of it. So I don't know if that's from previous work that was done on this engine or what, but it's a good thing that the oil filter did catch that. And this oil filter was replaced only a couple 100 miles ago when I had it at the dealership for some work. So this was my first time taking off the oil filter on this car, and I wasn't too sure how much of a mess it would make. So I had paper towels there just in case, but it wasn't messy at all. I let the car sit for a while before I started this work, so all the oil had drained back down into the oil pan. Next thing to do is remove the filter stem on there, and that's going to be with your 24mm deep socket. So I'm glad that I had my breaker bar with me in order to remove that stem, because it was torqued down pretty good. Once I removed the stem, took a microfiber towel and just made sure that the surface was clean of any old oil and debris. Now I'm going to install the oil cooler, making sure that this tab here lines up with that indent there. And before I loosely install the cooler, I'm going to lubricate with fresh oil this O-ring there, and then I'm going to put the new stem. I'm not going to tighten it down fully, but I'm going to tighten it down hand tight. So with both the heater hoses pulled through, our goal is going to be to connect one to this location here and then one just below it. Now those two clips are going to have to come off, and I'm going to put a rag down just beneath that hose in order to catch any coolant that comes out. And what I'm going to do before disconnecting that U-hose there, I'm going to pull, looks like this is the longer one here. You're going to want to bend in it because you're not going to want any sharp bends, but you're going to want a shallow bend in it. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to measure it and cut it to length, and then I'm going to do the same thing with this hose here. I'm going to make sure I cut them before I remove that U hose. This way they're ready to go on pretty quick in case there is any coolant that comes out, and I'll show you what that looks like. So this is what the bend looks like. I'll put the exact measurement of that hose in the description. Kind of messed with it a little bit, cut, saw how it looked. I would cut again and see it. At first I kind of had it looped out here in this area. That really didn't make too much sense. This looks to be the most direct way to do it and with the least bend in it. And then in order to get to that clamp in the back, that tension clamp, what I found worked the best was use a long pair of needle nose pliers. So that's what I used there. And then when it came time to put that clamp back on the hose, I kind of held the clamp open with the needle nose pliers, and at the same time I just used a flathead screwdriver to get the clamp in the exact position that I want to. Just kind of push back on it while I held it open. And when I took off that bottom hose, about maybe half a cup of coolant came out. So just be prepared for that. No coolant came out of that top hose. And I'll show you the size of the hose that came off. So this is that U hose that came off. And looking at it, it looks to be around the same size hose that I went with, that 5/16, and it's slid on there very easily, and there's not a bulge with it connected. So that's the reason why I chose that size, because I thought it was a good in-between size to step down from the oil cooler to fit those two smaller pipes there. And that's what it looks like with both the heater hoses installed. Next thing to do is torque down the stem to 40 foot-pounds there, and then reattach your oil filter. When I took mine off, I put a rubber glove over it so it wouldn't catch any debris while I was working. And I recommend that you also put a rubber glove over your throttle body. This way you don't get any coolant that splashes up in there or any dirt. So in my case, I'm just gonna make sure I wipe it out real quick. Looks like there's a little bit of dirt that got caught up in there, so I recommend a glove over that as well. After you torque down your stem, reinstall your oil filter, then go ahead and install your intake elbow. So with everything connected up front, I'm gonna go ahead and start the car. I'm gonna go look for any leaks. Then I'm gonna give it some revs. And then I'm gonna shut it off. So total time elapsed there was 1 minute. I'm gonna give it 2 minutes to cool down, and then I'm gonna open up this vent cap here in one of the heater hoses that leads to the firewall, and there should be coolant that comes out, or should be able to see it start to dribble out if it's full. But with the addition of those two lines, I may have to go ahead and top off the radiator. It's worth noting that before I started this project, I did fill the radiator when it was cold. You never want to open this when it's hot, but I did top off the radiator and fill up my reservoir to the full line. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up and see what happens. There was a little bit that dribbled out there. So there was some air that came out of there when I opened it up. Next thing to do is to let the car warm up for a while with the heater. I'll show you. Start up the car, and once it's running, we're gonna put the heater all the way hot, but on low until the fan kicks in the front. And that's gonna make sure that the coolant moves around the system, moves into the heater core of the car. It's gonna take a little bit, it's cold today. And then after that happens, probably have to run for around 15 minutes or so. Then I'll have to let it cool down for a while, and I'll top off the radiator there once it's fully cool, and I'll check the level of the reservoir. So overall, this took me under an hour to do, and should be a pretty good mod. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.